Okay, so I'm going to be trying to get through this kind of seminal work of Lyndon Larouche called The Secrets Known Only to the Inner Elites. It was published on the Campaigner magazine, Journal of the National Caucus of Labor Committees, volume number 2, number 3 to 4, and it was published in May, June 1978. So at this time, I guess it was a bi-monthly. And there's an editorial at the front, History versus Hysteria. I might read that because it does look interesting. It goes into the difference between maybe that's not the same article I looked at before. Never mind about that article. Um, anyway, Secrets Known Only to the Inner Elite. It's pretty much one of these famous things that kind of resulted in the transference of the Larouche movement from this radical socialist movement to a more capitalist-oriented movement and towards a very, very pro-Western um, Republican movement. And a lot of people have criticized them for not understanding Plato, but there's actually good points made. If you look at the lessons by Dennis Small or something like that, they're available on YouTube. There's actually, I think, a lot of misconceptions about Plato. There's things that are inherently contradictory towards the texts, where philosophers or critics will say that the texts or Plato says one thing when it's simply a character in dialogue saying one thing, and they attribute that to Plato. Well, that's not how it works, and actually the character that Plato represents refutes them. So there are many good things to learn from the Larouche movement, um, but there's also that kind of 10%, 20% that's wrong. But this is a very strange article. There's also a lot to learn here, and it kind of winds together Neoplatonism and uh, republicanism throughout history. And then the other side is basically this system of mystical, Eastern-oriented, Malthusian-type cults. So, without further ado, we'll go on. Uh, so here is the selected summary, I guess. Through 3 millennia of recorded history to date, centered around the Mediterranean, the civilized world has been run by two bitterly opposed elites. The one associated with the faction of Socrates and Plato, the other with the faction of Aristotle. During these thousands of years, until the developments of approximately 1784 to 1818 in Europe, both factions' inner elites maintained in some fashion an unbroken continuity of organization and knowledge through all of the political catastrophes which afflicted each of them in various times and locales. Forward. The cleverest way psychologically in which to hide a secret is to divert the investigator down a tiring trail towards a false discovery. His own efforts convince him that either he has found a secret through great energy and cleverness on his own part, or if the secret he seeks appears still but too barely eludes grasp, he values all the more his continued course of misdirection. That is the lesson which can be learned from Edgar Allan Poe's fictional case of the Purloined Letter, exemplary of the follies into which presumably educated and informed people are misled in the pursuit of the snipe, are the doctrines of the international Jewish conspiracy and the recent, more popular international communist conspiracy. During the 20th century, more people have turned into dupes along those two false trail pursuits than any competing obsessions. The effect of that sort of misdirected search for the ultimate global master conspiracy is principally twofold. The dupes themselves are misled away from the secrets being hidden in this manner. Secondly, the discredit which is directed to fall upon the lured turns most others foolishly away from all searches for the secrets of those inner elites, which have in fact run the world's affairs during approximately 3,000 years of known history. To illustrate the corollary aspect of this problem, during a meeting between this writer and leading political figure in Italy, which occurred during early 1976, the latter asked, "Why is it that the Ugo La Malfa always comes out on top?" The context of his question was the period of initial efforts to replace La Malfa preferred moral government with an Andreotti government. In the course of most of the post-war politics crisis in Italy, tiny, now aging Ugo La Malfa, spokesman for the relatively tiny Republican Party of Italy, appeared to play the tunes to which Italy subsequently danced. The answer to this particular question is essentially Ugo La Malfa has been a key Italian agent of influence for British intelligence services all of his adult life. This is not to suggest that British intelligence services operatives individually are supermen. In general, such agents, including leading operations, are a poor lot. Short attention span, scattered-brained, without moral mooring worth mention, easily provoked in the loss of personal self-control. The majority downright louts, bores. So Ugo La Malfa himself, it is not British intelligence services viewed in the terms that presumably informed laymen ordinarily thinks of intelligence service, which are relevant to the indicated problem of La Malfa. Although British intelligence networks do have inclusively the sort of characteristics the misinformed layman would expect, more or less, it is not such incidentals which account for the La Malfa's past successes. The relevant key point can be abstracted fairly thus. Since the English traders Robert Cecil and Francis Bacon, around the onset of the 17th century and later, most notably from the 1660 Stuart Restoration to the present day, within and behind British intelligence regular and irregular services, there is an inner circle representing the ranks of the Black Guelph families of Europe. That is the Este family. That is the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and many more. Cancellieri. Black Guelph families of all of Europe, an oligarchy gathered around the privileges and powers of the British and Dutch monarchies. Attached to and overlapping their oligarchical families, there is a special collectivity, traditionally centered notably in Oxford, Cambridge, and Sussex universities, an inner intelligentsia of that faction which studies the classics, thereby to gain the knowledge through which the forces associated with the British monarchy may rule the world. Through 3 millennia of recorded history to date, centered around the Mediterranean, the civilized world has been run by 2 bitterly opposed elites. The one association with the faction of Socrates and Plato, the other with the faction of Aristotle. During these thousands of years, until the developments of approximately 1784, 1818 in Europe, both factions' inner elites maintained in some fashion an unbroken continuity of organization and knowledge through all of the political catastrophes which afflicted each of them in various times and locales. Now, I want to add something. It is very strange that one of the far relatives that hails from England, I think was a Norman, maybe was native to England. We're talking about in the first millennium, was known as the philosopher. And a lot of people reference Aristotle as the philosopher. But this guy in England, this is just an interesting fact that I picked up, was a king. And he was the father of the entire Diesta, entire Guelph branch that eventually housed itself in Swabia and housed itself in Venice and the immediate Lombard cities around it. And that's just a fun fact that they both have the same title, the philosopher. And I want to get into that more because there are some people who do historical revision who say, no, Aristotle wasn't really written at such and such date, which is probably absolutely specious, but that somebody else could have written these things, and amazingly enough, it could have been basically a Guelph monarch who wrote this. There's a complete specious pet theory, but we'll go on. During the thousands of years until the developments of approximately 1784 to 1818 in Europe, both factions' inner elites maintained in some fashion an unbroken continuity of organization and knowledge through all of the political catastrophes which afflicted each of them in various times and locales. It was the political elite associated with the Platonic or Neoplatonic faction which organized the American Revolution and established the United States as a democratic constitutional republic. During the early 18th century, circumstances associated with Marlborough's campaign and the Mississippi and South Sea Bubbles plot, the continuity of the Platonic faction was first administered a broad temporary defeat with some lasting effects, and was shattered later as a world force through the events of 1784 to 1818. In the aftermath of the 1815 Treaty of Vienna, the shattering of the power of the Platonic elite in Europe meant in large measure both a scattering of the main forces of a secret faction and association, increasing loss of the secret knowledge through which the Platonic inner elite had formally developed and exercised its factional power. From that time to the present period, the inner circles of the Aristotelian, or more exactly Neo-Aristotelian, factions have been hegemonic increasingly in ordering world affairs. Although humanist Platonic factional forces have continued in existence and are represented among political and related elites today, the Platonic elite has lost connection to the body of knowledge upon which its former power depended. The person who posed the question cited is exemplary of this problem. He is not only a Christian humanist and a member of the ruling political elite, but a man of unusual personal character as well as political skills and power. Yet, with the considerable knowledge available to him, he did not know the answer to the question. Any member of the Platonic elite in command of the secret knowledge of that tradition would have known the answer immediately. The principal function of this report is summarily but systematically identify the secret knowledge of the Platonic inner elite. That includes the Platonic's knowledge of the secrets of the enemy, Aristotelian elite. Although the objective of this writer and his associates is to end the ages-long division between elites and the credulous myth-ridden masses, this cannot be accomplished usefully by bringing the elite down to the ignorance of the masses. The masses must be brought up out of the mythology script to attain the qualities of the Platonic elite. That accomplishment is impossible without a leading role of a reconstituted Platonic elite. Education is impossible without the educators. Such transformation of mass of the plebeians is the work of years, even under favorable circumstances. At this moment of writing, it would be a criminal folly to propose to wait years before bringing the Platonic faction back into a leading position in the government of society. If the Neo-Aristotelian faction prevails through the present period, it is more inconceivable that the human race might not survive, or at best that the new beginnings of civilization would have to be assembled from the shards of general thermonuclear warfare. The Platonic elite, in the fullness of its knowledge, must be reconstituted now. That cannot occur unless the secret knowledge of that faction is reestablished with the aid of reference to classical knowledge resurrected in appropriate modern terms of reference. That indispensable articulation is the function of this report. The conspirators. Yes, Adelaide, the world has been run by conspiratorial elites employing secret knowledge. In its lesser aspects, that conspiracy has subsumed features which coincide at first impression with what you might imagine a conspiracy to be. However, if you pursue the investigation from the standpoint of your usual misguided preconceptions of a global conspiracy, you will only be misled yourself into another pathetic concoction of mixed facts, half-truths, and fantasies, like the concoctions associated with the international Jewish conspiracy or international communist conspiracy. Global conspiracies which function succeed by establishing controlled environments around the minds of the credulous masses of the world. Such a controlled environment is summed up efficiently by stating that the credulous masses are ruled by mythologies and that the elites rule such masses by creating, shaping, and manipulating mythologies. The methods employed by Joseph Goebbels and carried further by British intelligence networks for creating and manipulating the mythologies of credulous masses through control of all, or at least key portions of the press and radio television, are the center of modern techniques to this effect. Outside and above the foolish folk who rely upon the New Washington Post, New York Times, London Times, or the popular women's magazines, and so on and so forth, there's a governing elite. This elite does not possess secret knowledge, or this elite does possess secret knowledge. The first aspect of this special knowledge, which makes it efficiently secret, is that the elite not only know that the mythologies are mythologies, but also know that they themselves create and use those mythologies to manipulate the credulous masses. Beyond that first broad level of division between the knowledgeable and the credulous, the secret knowledge is distinguished by the division of the elite into two irreconcilable factions. Beyond the sheep-pens of the believers in mythologies, there exist two fundamentally opposed views of what to do with the world, to adopt in steering the historical movement of human species. One elite, the humanist, the Platonic or Neoplatonic faction, is dedicated to steering the course of history away from the rule through mythologies. The other, the Aristotelians and their heirs, is committed to strengthening the rule by mythology for the purpose of establishing a permanent feudal-like utopia of obedient, simple-minded folk ruled by a tenured neo-Aristotelian oligarchy. The secret knowledge is, at first distinction, as secret as the purloined letter of the Poe tale. Once the mythologies are known to be mythologies, the primitive aspect of truth lies factually in plain sight. Once mythology is cast aside, the development of real knowledge out of such primitive truth, the development of properly termed scientific progress begins. In the case of La Malfa, the point to be made is this. Ugo La Malfa, like Cusia of Mediobanca, Riccardo Lombardi of the Socialist Party of Italy, and Amendola and Napolitano of the leadership of the Communist Party of Italy, began his career as a British intelligence services agent under the tutelage of the same evil Benedetto Croce, who mentally crippled Antonio Gramsci and many others. Together with the British intelligence services, Italian mafia, and British allied black nobility of Italy, the networks radiating from Croce's original base at Naples University are among the principal forces that presently govern Italy from within. For London. In the end, it is the Black Guelph oligarchy of Italy, which is the local branch of the real rulers, the mafia, together with such persons as La Malfa, Lombardi, and Amendola, are merely the expendable mercenaries. The central figure of work of Croce, the key to his usefulness of his British masters, was his circle's mastery of Italian mythologies. As scientific or scholarly work, Croce's writings on Hegel and aesthetics are infantile rubbish. However, they are not merely rubbish, they represent a model for the nonsense an ignorant, superstitious Italian will tend to swallow. In this way, Croce and his circle made themselves craft masters of manipulation of Italy's characteristic methodologies. They are the qualified shepherders of the sheep of Italy, the sheep who have made up the majority of Italy's myth-ridden population. On this account, it should be readily understood. The notable folly of La Malfa's opponents is that they esteem themselves practical politicians. In other words, in their brilliance. As with Machiavelli and his fatal worst feature, they define the art of ruling as one of bending with the winds of prevailing mythologies, the mythologies employed by their adversaries. They seek to bend the levers of such prevailing mythology, intending to move political processes into directions which correspond in actuality with the real interest of Italy and its people. By committing such a blunder of practical politics, sometimes termed ductility, they commit themselves to leading within the limits of the sheep pen that La Malfa and his British masters control, the sheep pen of British-controlled Italian mythologies. A popularized mythology is like a goldfish bowl. No matter how cleverly the fish chooses his direction within the bowl, he can never escape it in such a fashion, no matter how cleverly he adapts to the environment of the bowl's medium. Whoever moves the bowl moves him in a corresponding direction. The misguided realists, practical politicians, and this is regarded as wisdom to maintain influence and credibility in terms of popular political mythologies, to attempt to bend the internal features of the enemy-controlled mythologies into the direction agreeable to the interest of the nation and its people. Those for whom La Malfa speaks control the medium within, which the humanists so situate themselves. Thus, and not by any advantage of personal prowess, La Malfa has often appeared to win in most of the political crises of Italy today. The same political arrangement prevails in North America and throughout Western Europe to present present day. It prevails in most of the developing sector and in a somewhat different form in Eastern Europe. Only a relative handful of persons in any nation have knowledge of the true reasons behind the policies currently at issue. The masses, together with most of the persons ordinarily considered national leaders, know only the myths, the mythologies through which their minds and wills are manipulated by others. The institution of ballot democracy, massive vote frauds momentarily overlooked, have done little to improve this principle. What does it mean to have the power to vote? If masses vote, fraud determines the official tallies, or if the knowledge given to the voter is predominantly a myth, and if the voter's criteria of the judgment are chiefly mythological. If you, Adelaide, are a typical plebeian, you are still today largely a puppet of those elites which control the shaping and manipulation of your adopted mythologies. Heading: The Aristotelian Enemies of Man. For reasons better understood on the basis of the body of this report, the only effectively ruling elite in the capitalist sector of the world today has been the neo-Aristotelian faction in the inner circles of the force centered in Britain. The humanist elite exists, but with handfuls of exceptions, relatively speaking, chiefly scattered exceptions, lacks the secret knowledge upon which its global effectiveness depends. For reasons we shall identify in due course, the present center of the power of the neo-Aristotelian or oligarchical faction, the Persian model faction, is the black wealth monarchies of Britain and Holland. The power of both monarchies consolidated under the British. So as we account for the black wealth faction as a whole, we focus here upon its center, the British monarchy. And for modern day, I would say you can add the House of Saud in there. They are becoming a extremely important, especially after 9/11, an extremely important player on the world scale. And their checking accounts are starting to match that of the British monarchy. And they really are what you could call the second British monarchy. So, going on. One of the most notable frauds afoot in today's credulous world is the myth of British democracy. British constitutional government. Britain has, in fact, two governments. The first, a parliamentary charade for the edification of the credulous, the other, the real monarchical government. With notable aid from corrupt Presbyterians, the House of Orange and its Amsterdam banking allies overthrew the British Commonwealth in 1660, installing the Dutch puppets, the House of Stuart, upon the British throne. Those Stuarts proved to have several important defects as Dutch puppets, more narrowly this being typical of immorality and venality of the Scottish aristocracy generally. The Stuarts sold their favors wherever the market prices suited them, including circles around for the French monarchy. Most significantly, under James II, the Stuart monarchy was reviving the efforts of the 1640-1660 period. The Dutch chose to reorganize the British government preemptively under the direct supervision of the House of Orange. The late 17th century House of Orange had no moral resemblance to its predecessor William the Silent. The Dutch Neoplatonic humanism of William the Silent had been continued by the De Witt, who was an ally of Benedict Spinoza. The wars between France and Holland had enabled the corrupt House of Orange to oust De Witt's humanists. Now, what's funny is, I think in the Larouche mythology, Benedict Spinoza eventually becomes a member of the oligarchical faction as Larouche changes his mind about epistemology. But we have to go on. It's a long article. Late 17th century House of Orange, allied by marriage to the ruling Black Wealth House of Hanover, and otherwise thoroughly committed to Black Wealth policies in its own right, undertook to neutralize the Republican ferment within the larger portion of English population by instituting the form of theater known variously as British constitutional monarchy and British liberalism. By giving the credulous British plebeians the thoroughly corrupted to this day British Parliament with which to amuse themselves, the Black Wealth Orange Hanover monarchy preserved to itself all it considered essential respecting the actual government of the United Kingdom. By cultivated popular reputation, the British monarchy is a quaint enclave of ceremonial functions, plugging along quaintly on its annual household budget of a few millions. It, like its associates among the Black Wealth aristocratic families of continental Europe, is reputed by the credulous to exist principally to provide editorial copy for the society pages of certain news media and for those quaint little women's magazines so popular among those most brutalized portions of the European population. In reality, the British monarchy defines a domain of special powers and privileges outside the reach of existing practices of parliamentary control. It is screened from inquiry by the doctrine of lèse-majesté and by an arrangement known as the Official Secrets Act. Though the monarchy's own privileged financial activities and through interface with and discretion of the Bank of England and a select group of private merchant banking families, it is the enterprise of one of the most powerful financial institutions in the world. It is otherwise armed with extra-parliamentary control of Britain's combined official and unofficial intelligence services and has de facto as well as some nominal control over the British military. The power is nominally located in the powers and privilege of the incumbent monarch. That aspect of this matter has a certain importance, but represents far too narrow focus. The British monarchy is best viewed as a rallying point for the assemblage of oligarchical families, both British and Commonwealth nations, and also strata of the allied oligarchical families of Europe. These oligarchical families, together with their most trusted political servants, gather around and behind the trusted political servants, or gather around and behind the screen of powers and privilege of the British monarchy. Through such and related means, and through the vast networks of influence they have developed among many nations over recent centuries, these combined forces control and deploy one of the most powerful forces on earth today and most efficiently evil force today. The neo-Aristotelian secret knowledge of these oligarchical forces is transmitted to each generation within the privileged strata in principally a threefold way. Number one, families themselves transmit their oligarchical tradition, a certain way of viewing the world and matters its policy. This transmission is both explicit and implicit. Some of the old families of Europe on both sides of the struggle have organized memories going back to Charlemagne's time. More characteristically, the reach of tradition is between approximately 4 and 8 centuries. The explicit formal aspect of the transmission of family tradition centers around glossed genealogies, preferably illustrated with family portraits. More broadly, implicitly, the tradition is transmitted through a kind of drill governing the rearing of the young. Second, the British oligarchical tradition and attitudes are shaped into forms of knowledgeable world outlook, varying degrees of depth and breadth from case to case by Oxford, Cambridge, and Sussex universities. The London School of Economics is chiefly the center for recruiting foreigners to British intelligence service. Together with these universities, there are the public schools which feed into the former. These institutions provide the center and model for the gentleman's education of the oligarchies young throughout the world. Number three, the articulation of policies and strategies agreeable to that tradition is accomplished through aid of various think tanks. Oxford, Cambridge, and Sussex University include privileged domains, which are the core of such arrangements. These are institutions which coordinate the British Secret Intelligence Service, SIS or MI6, MI5, and the London Tavistock Institute. Other British institutions controlling British policy include its intelligence services policies, include the Round Table, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and the International Institute of Strategic Studies. The British intelligence services operate branches of IISS in many nations, including a part of the New York Council on Foreign Relations and Aspen Institute in the United States. The Trilateral Commission is predominantly an arm of British intelligence services. The London Tavistock Institute controls the United Nations Organization's World Federation of Mental Health, and the mother and continuing influence of the RAND Corporation runs the Fabian operation against the United States United Mine Workers Union and many other institutions, including international terrorist networks in many nations. And that is the Tavistock Institute we're talking about. It is notable that many persons in high positions in the United States and other nations are both nominally and efficiently British intelligence services agents of influence. The U.S. Labor Party has publicly documented the case of Henry A. Kissinger, the cases of Vice President Walter A. Mondale, Senator Edward Kennedy, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Warner Michael Blumenthal, James R. Schlesinger, and many others could be added. The Watergate against President Richards set up from both administration by Kissinger, General Alexander Haig, and other British agents of influence, run on the outside largely by the networks of the Institute for Policy Studies and corrupt complicit elements of the press, themselves either British agents outright or British agents of influence. The United States is only the most important of the nations massively subverted by the British intelligence services in this way. The secret knowledge The core of the knowledge guiding the overall direction of work of the British intelligence services is secret knowledge, based ultimately in the classics. The control of secret knowledge is centered in the collectivity represented by an inner intelligentsia of oligarchical elite, a collectivity centered within Oxford and Cambridge universities. On condition that one knows the classics and also the practical part of the knowledge embodied in them, which admittedly few do, the secret knowledge of British intelligence services stands out as clearly as the sought-for letter stands out to the winning personality in Poe's story. Most relevantly to this point is the evidence proving the distinction between what Oxford and Cambridge know and what they profess publicly to believe. The point is illustrated by the case of Thales' associate Anaximenes. Everyone knows that Anaximenes specified air to be one of the primary constituents of all substance. Yet the Greek term, which Oxford and Cambridge in particular have certified to signify air, has approximately the same meaning as the modern German Geist, which is mind or spirit, precisely defined by the context of usage. The fraud is so blatant that the translator who perpetrates it shows that he is engaged in a witting hoax. Yet the credulous PhDs and others who piously recite the fraud and interpret Anaximenes from this standpoint have not yet had their degrees revoked, least of all not by Oxford and Cambridge. Most of the widely accredited textbooks on classical, philosophical, and related topics are riddled with, indeed, based on blatant hoaxes to the same effect, to get at the real issues of the 4th century BC and earlier, and to trace the consequences of those continuing issues over subsequent centuries into the recent 18th century. One is obliged to discard the largest portion of the credited secondary sources as either witting frauds or as a learned fool's glosses on the frauds he pathetically repeats. Focusing for the moment only on the explicitly British conduct of such frauds, instances such as those we cited in connection with Anaximenes prove conclusively that the inner circles centered around Oxford and Cambridge are engaged in effort to conceal the most vital issues of historical scholarship to their own advantage. By these means, they convert the most vital categories of historical knowledge into the secret knowledge of the inner elites. The elites not duped by the mythologies of popular universities, classics, and political science departments. Once one knows that this fraud exists, sufficient primary and other suitable source documentation exists to reconstruct the core of the truth in these matters, even acknowledging the masses of ancient documents which may be buried away from the honest scholar's view in one fashion or another. Consequently, the bare facts of the secret knowledge do indeed represent a likeness to the case of the purloined letter. The knowledge, admittedly widely scattered, exists in large measure on condition one knows what one is seeking and what sort of place it is located in which fashion. That is the principal secret of the British intelligence services, the core of the body of secret knowledge, through which the British and their accomplices have largely ruled the world during recent centuries. We are not to be accused of singling out arbitrarily the 7th through 4th centuries BC in this connection. Once one has understood the crucial issues of that period of civilization and knows how the issues shape the course of subsequent history, there exists with certainty no more important secrets to be discovered respecting past or present. That fact will be made clearer in the course of this report. We now cite one related important case here. We cite the case of the influential hoax known as the Jewish religion. All right. So, warning, trigger alert. So Larouche, I forget who actually came up with this thesis, but there is a thesis that's been going around that it's still going around, that the Jewish religion was completely made up. It existed after the publishing of the New Testament. In some case, that's kind of true. It was reorganized, but it is rather controversial, and I don't necessarily support the thesis. So here we go. The modern Jewish religion originated not with the kingdom of Solomon or earlier, but centuries later as a synthetic cult created by the order of Babylonians and other non-Jews. The first step in fashioning of the Jewish relation was based on piecing together scraps of Mesopotamian legends and anti-Phoenician and anti-Egyptian propaganda, with odd pieces of actual Babylonian and other history added to the mixture. The latter infusion gave a credible calendar to otherwise fraudulent concoction. This original Mesopotamian hoax was reworked repeatedly, always under the supervision of non-Jews, with the basic structure of the Old Testament hoax completed during the Persian Empire period. Yeah, see, this is really, from a traditional Catholic standpoint, from a biblical scholar standpoint, this is, I don't even know how you could prove all of this. This is just kind of made up from comparative religion, something like German higher criticism or something, which Larouche very much follows, especially Friedrich Schiller's Mission of Moses and I think Lessig's influence on German higher criticism. This hoax was first introduced into European languages about 230 BC on the recommendation of the same Aristotelian peripatetics who contrived the exotic cults of Ptolemaic Egypt and other orders from the Ptolemies. That edition of the 70 is otherwise notable for the fact that it was produced in a variety of demotic Greek peculiar to such locations as the waterfront brothels of Egypt. Later, when Philo of Alexandria attempted to develop a Platonic version of Judaism, the roots of later Sephardic tradition of Maimonides and Aventurable, Philo avoided, for obvious political reasons, simply throwing out the mess before him. He attempted to circumvent the problem by the rabbinical, pharisaical ruse of the commentary, tolerating the text while fundamentally altering the reading to be attributed to it. The Christian apostles, confronted with the same general problem, rid Christianity of the worst implications of the Old Testament by emphasizing the dispensation of Christ and warning against the dangers of the concision. Christ had freed man from such barbarisms as the Old Testament. Now, this is, once again, German higher criticism, dispensationalism. No. Only the sections of the Old Testament which pointed towards the coming of the Messiah or otherwise happened to coincide with Christianity were to be treated seriously. And that's not true either. It does not follow from this that the apostles were in any fashion hoaxers of the Aristotelian varieties. Apostolic Christianity always, and rightly so, regarded Aristotelian as an organized force for evil, as did the great religious thinkers of European Renaissance. Even Thomas Aquinas belatedly associated himself among such thinkers by acknowledging during the period before his death that all his preceding writings had been fundamentally in error. Now, this I didn't know. Apostolic Christianity and its leading continuations were always Platonic or Neoplatonic in respect of philosophical method. Aristotelian syncretic methods and Aristotelianism were introduced to Christianity initially by way of vestiges of the cult of Apollo in the effort of collapsing the Roman Empire to develop an episcopal form of Christianity in conformity with pagan Aristotelian policies for design and use of state religious cults. Although that view is now usually supported with such frankness by published church histories, many leading theologians, notably including Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, are explicit on the problem of Aristotelianism. However, those theologians who concur with our judgment have generally regarded it as an imprudent to disturb the naive faith of the ignorant with historical problems of this sort. This policy within the church circles intersects the fact that both the Platonics and Aristotelians adhered for opposite reasons to the doctrines of controlling the masses of people through mythologies. Since the point has also fundamental importance for the whole matter of this report, the Platonic view of the cited church practice should be summarized at this point. The Platonic method, rightly... Hold on. Let's see. How much more do I have? Because I want to end. So we're going to stop once we get to the outer limits of Marxism. So the Platonic method rightly distinguishes three qualities of knowledge, mental levels among people. The first lowest condition of the human mind is the level of simple belief. Belief premised on the popular mythologies and prejudices and on state of ignorance concerning individual experience, otherwise known as common sense. The second, next high level of knowledge is equivalent to the condition of understanding, defined by Immanuel Kant, the mere understanding. Persons at this level have consistently knowledge of the ostensibly lawful features of practice in certain various categories of human practice in general. This is a condition corresponding to the lowest level of what may be termed scientific knowledge. Such persons do not know why such categories exist, or how or why the ostensibly lawful principles appropriate to such categories are determined. They have merely practical knowledge of consistent cause and effect features of practice in those categories of experience in which they have been educated. The third highest level of human knowledge is reason, otherwise termed Plato's Socratic reason. It is only on this level that truth can be efficiently comprehended. The knowledge of the two lower levels is necessarily mythological, false, or as Spinoza specifies, fictitious. For such reason, the Platonics judged mythologies twofoldly. First, all mythologies they knew to be inherently false, fictitious, but no person could rise above mythologies except by attaining reason. Therefore, dealing with masses living at inferior levels of mental life, it was deemed necessary to deal with them on the terms of mythological belief. The issue of practical politics therefore took the task-oriented form of distinguishing among destructive and useful mythologies. Those forms of simple beliefs or mere understanding which tended to allow society to move in directions otherwise required by reason were deemed the tolerable class of mythologies. Those other mythologies which tended towards evil consequences were evil beliefs which must be fought accordingly. It is impossible to understand the central doctrinal issues among leading Christian theologians from the apostolic period to present times without taking the Platonic view inclusively into account. These theologians have been concerned for themselves and for the determination of policy with the issues of truth according to reason. They have been at the same time otherwise concerned with popular mythologies, respecting chiefly the issue whether this or that popular belief led way from or towards the realization of the dictates of reason. Although the objective has been to bring all of mankind into the state of reason, and he has this reason as atonement, for immediate purposes, the rule has been that this effort must be situated within terms of the problem defined by the simple beliefs of the ignorant. The Aristotelians, on the other hand, and their heirs, notably including Bernard of Clairvaux, Martin Luther, and the Presbyterian leaders, had and continue an opposite policy concerning mythologies. The original Aristotelians were the intelligence services arms of the oligarchies, jointly controlling the court of Philip of Macedon and their contemporary Persian court at the time. Their objectives were to stop technological and scientific progress, integrate zero-growth synthetic mythologies as the simple beliefs of the ignorant masses. These efforts they regarded as the means to establish permanent world rule by a landlord-based oligarchy, de-emphasizing cities in favor of countryside and maintaining Malthusian zero-growth, anti-technology policies against scientific progress. They have not altered that method or purpose to the present day. The innermost belief of the leading Christian theologians, which access to reason, is typified by the outlook of Peter Abelard of the 11th century AD, where strict Aristotelians argued that God made himself impotent by creating alterable laws for the universe, and hence only omniscience. Abelard defined the function of man's existence according to reason to be the helper of God in continuing the work of creation. Abelard located lawfulness in the lawfulness governing the ordering of continued creation. The exact opposite position was classically argued by the 12th century Bernard of Clairvaux, a point of importance we shall cover in the course of this report. So I'm going to stop there. This is part one of this strange seminal work of Lyndon Larouche called The Secrets Known Only to the Inner Elite. Obviously, I think that Nicholas of Cusa was okay with the Catholic Church, but Peter Abelard was definitely a heretic. And yeah. The whole point is, what he's saying, if you can't read between the lines, is that religion is a set of mythologies used to either steer people in the right direction or steer people away from that. Of course, then he goes into these kind of unprovable, German higher criticism type stories about Philip of Macedon which I think that the Aristotelians were working for the court of Philip of Macedon, and there were some weird things that were going on there. Specifically, I think a betrayal by Aristotle himself. But there's no way that you could possibly know what was going on. But I guess he tries. I mean, he's making his own mythology with this article, right? Which is funny. He's applying the very thing that he's telling you other people are using in order to craft your worldview to be stuck with his. At the same time, I mean, it is true, but that the world's elite do use these methodologies, but that can't be all that there is to truth. And maybe he goes on and explains that later on. I think that he does. But so we'll start with the outer limits of Marxism next time, which is the next section. And it actually gets into a three-part section. It goes from the legacy of Aristotle. There's lots of pretty pictures here from what I see that you won't be able to see unless if you get the text. And then the humanist city builders of medieval Europe. Just another. Oh, I think it goes into Giordano Bruno. Oh, here it is. The Key to History. It's the next second part. Oh my goodness. This is such a long report, and there's so many charts and graphs and things in here. It is certainly worth looking at. But this is kind of like a grand theory of everything in physics, or applied to history. Okay, so there's really only two sections. One is the legacy of the Aristotelians, and the other is how to view that in the entire history of mankind. So, all right, this is I Read Old Magazines, and I guess we're going to call it quits for tonight.